What's up, YouTube? Welcome back. So, I want to talk about and go through this article that I ran across on the internet. And the title of the article is What's Colorism? And then the subheading is Colorism bias has real effects. Do you and your students know how to talk about it? And this article was written by David Knight and the illustration by Alex Eben Myers. So, this topic really caught my attention because this is a topic of colorism that I haven't discussed. You know, um, should colorism be discussed in public K through 12 schools? You know, and there's some arguments for it. And there's some arguments against it. You know, so what I'm going to do is read through certain parts of the article and kind of give my opinions and thoughts as I go, and as well afterward, talk about the article as well. The article, for those of you who want to know, the article was published in a publication called Teaching Tolerance. It was published in their fall 2015 issue. And the article is about, in total, 4 pages. The first page is a cover page, so that not really much to read on that. So really 3 pages, 3 pages worth of information. All right. So let's begin. And this article is by David Knight. All right. So I'm going to read through I'm not going to read the whole thing, but just certain points, right? All right. When I began teaching in Boston, I was struck by how often students of color refer to each other as light skin or dark skin. And I'll say my educational experience in public schools and whatnot, I mean, we did refer to each other as like dark skin and light skin, but it wasn't like, it happened, but it wasn't like frequent. It wasn't like that was like our main identities, but it was like we would acknowledge when someone is like dark skin or light skin, in certain situations, right? Like if some sort of a issue when it comes to like attraction, or a colorism issue comes up or something like that. Thankfully, I will say my public school, like my educational experience in grade school, thankfully wasn't tarnished by colorism. But unfortunately, I've heard stories that does happen in schools, unfortunately, where kids are colorist and, perpetuate colorism in school and all that crazy stuff. All right. So next. But I did not expect that so many young people of diverse ethnicities, including Dominicans, Puerto Ricans, and Cape Verdeans, would actively engage in everyday forms of skin color bias. As one teacher in the classroom, what was I to do? But yeah, I've heard about those groups. I've heard about those groups. Not so much the Puerto Ricans, not so much, but definitely the Dominicans and Cape Verdeans. All right, next. Within group and between group prejudice in favor of lighter skin color, what feminist author Alice Walker calls colorism. Alice Walker coined the term colorism. And of course, the world's first dark-skinned activist Rashida Stroper coined the phrase and term darkism. All right. But Alice Walker calls colorism is a global cultural practice, right? They say that colorism is global. you know. Its legacy is evident in forums as public as the television and movie industries, which prefer to cast lighter skinned people of color, and as private as internalized thoughts of some Latino, South Asian, or Black parents who hope their babies grow up light skinned so that their lives will be, quote unquote, just a little easier. It makes sense that teenagers who are working out their own identities on a day to day basis also engage in color conscious discourse. But how do young people negotiate such powerful stereotypes, particularly when many of the contributing elements are out of their control? Hmm. So that's a good question. But he's going to go on to answer it. So here we go. Research shows, okay, that's the next part of this article about research. All right. Since Kenneth and Mamie Clark's famous doll study of the 1950s, researchers have known that young people of color are profoundly aware of our nation's disdain for all that is dark. That's a bit, do you think that's hyperbole? Hmm. Color conscious banter between students reflect unconscious and unspoken bias, and are otherwise called implicit bias that favors lighter skin. So here they're saying that um, you know people often have some sort of a unconscious and unspoken bias, which is defined as having implicit bias. A more modern example of research on colorism comes from Eddie Fergus, an assistant professor of education at New York University, who conducted a study on Latino high school males. Fergus found that Mexican and Puerto Rican males with white-looking skin are perceived as white and sometimes treated more favorably, while boys of the same ethnicity who had darker complexions are perceived as black and often experience discrimination. All right. So basically, if you like white passing Latino, you cool. But if you like a brown Latino, then it's an issue, right? The colorism issue comes up. Um, Next, despite being close or even related, people of the same ethnicity face different expectations, different realities, and potentially different educational and economic outcomes solely based on their skin color, right? Like us within the black community, like we all, check the black box, black/African American box and may identify as black, but because of our skin tones, we do have different experiences within blackness. All right, next. Development psychologist Margaret Beale Spencer found in a CNN commissioned pilot study of skin color bias among U.S. children that white children attribute positive traits to lighter skin and negative traits to darker skin. And while black children also showed some racial bias toward whiteness, white children in particular hold on to these prejudices more strongly as they grow older. Quote unquote, our children are always mirrors, says Spencer in a CNN broadcast. And what we put out there, children report back. We are still living in a society where dark things are devalued and light things are valued. All right. So next, the association of dark skin with criminality has become one of the most deep-seated stereotypes in American society. Many social scientists say multiple studies have shown that dark-skinned people are perceived to be more suspicious, more likely to misbehave, and more likely to commit crimes. Again, perception, that's how people are perceiving darker skinned folks, but not necessarily how they're behaving. Research, recent research by psychologist Philip Goff and his colleagues at the University of California, Los Angeles, UCLA, found that police officers routinely overestimated the ages of Black and Latino children, but not white children. All right. What's more, the participants in the study who reported the most dehumanizing ideas about Black individuals, viewing them as non-human and ape-like, also overestimated Black children's ages to the largest extent, and were more likely to presume Black children were guilty, and were more likely to support the use of force against them. The next section, why care about colorism? All right, why? First, they force the realization that implicit bias is pervasive and must be examined if we are to serve students of all skin colors equally well. Jerry Kang, a law professor at UCLA, he says the following. Educators like lawyers and judges probably assume that they don't have bias because they choose to enter a profession helping others, he says. But whether assumptions others have, but whatever assumptions others have, teachers also have too. So basically he's saying people are biased, even if they enter professions where they want to help people, they still have a bias, often a color and racial bias. Another reason schools should pay attention to the research on colorism is that it offers the opportunity to launch necessary conversations. Quote unquote, my principal and just about all my colleagues are afraid to talk about race at all, or how our interaction with students may differ based on how we see them, says Catherine, a white teacher at an elementary school in Brooklyn, New York. While many people, educators included, do not want to talk about who does and does not benefit in a system that is supposed to be quote-unquote equal, the false colorblind premise that underpins the rhetoric of equality is not lost on many young people. So Jasper, an Asian American teacher in Sacramento, observes that his overwhelmingly Black middle school students are very aware that their teachers treat them slightly differently. Quote unquote, students say that the after-school teachers who happen to be Black prefer the lighter-skinned students, he says. Which is funny because some of our strongest students are dark-skinned. And to Jasper, this revelation shows that moving beyond colorblindness and colorism blindness is not simply about white people learning about the experiences of people of color. Quote unquote, it's about how each of us, regardless of our own color, owns up to our own biases and then does something about it. And for me, this one section in this article really hit home with me. And that's probably like the one thing, if you get nothing else from my videos, if you don't watch any more of my videos, the one thing that I want to leave you with, the one idea, if I had only one idea to leave you with, would be to own up to your bias, right? This is a bit off topic, but it still relates. Google released every year Google releases their workforce diversity report. And within their workforce diversity report, um, they had said something that's really interesting when it comes to bias. Bias in general, not colorism bias, but just bias in general. They said the following. Everyone is biased. Science shows that's how the human brain works. We don't expect people to rid themselves of all bias, but we want them to recognize it. Research shows that when we are more aware of unconscious bias, we make more objective decisions. Google said it, thus it's canon. But seriously, I completely agree with that. I think we do have to become more aware of our biases, and own up to them and admit to them. But I think that's where people don't want to do that. That's where the conflict comes in. That's where people get really PC and pretend like everything's all good in the hood when we know it ain't. Um, so the next part of this article, close to finishing. All right. Suggestions for teachers. All right. Staying current on the research related to colorism and implicit bias is an important first step. You can also do what Jasper does. Pose questions about color, status, and bias to your students. Quote unquote, when I ask students to think about the famous black women they know, and if they are light-skinned, they smile. He chuckles. They haven't articulated or thought about these issues as deeply. They collect the data of their experience, but have not come up with a hypothesis as 12-year-olds. Right? Teachers may not be able to control what happens within their institutions, but they can facilitate critical conversations within their classrooms and professional learning communities. Perhaps in doing this work, a colleague or two may begin to see and ideally talk about colorism. Right? And David Knight taught for several years in Boston and San Francisco. He researches and writes about issues related to youth, identity, politics, and education. All right. And the article also gives some tips on facilitating colorism conversations and helping break the silence. Let's see, many students of colors and other minority students perceive that their experiences with discrimination, injustice, and stigma neither belong nor hold much value in school. Therefore, establishing an inclusive classroom environment where students' experiences with implicit bias and colorism are validated can help empower young people to speak up for change. Okay? Provide students with language to explain the phenomena they witness on a regular basis. Teach students words such as implicit bias and colorism. Share examples of these concepts in U.S. history and culture. Point to examples of implicit bias in historical events and literature. For instance, eugenics, and the use of the human subject in science. Create opportunities for students to interact with each other across multiple lines of identity, such as race, religion, gender, socioeconomic class, ability, national origin, and sexual orientation. This work requires organizing learning tasks so that students regularly talk with, challenge, and learn from each other. Conscientiously grouping students so that they learn from each other's differences can help students witness one another's humanity. Okay? So long story short, I do think that colorism should be touched on in schools. However, I can understand some people may have an issue with that because they may feel like colorism is like low-key, like maybe like dirty laundry, perhaps. But I will say, if you think that racism should be touched on in school, then I think that colorism should be a part of that conversation as well. I say either you accept both or leave both. I think it would be weird to accept one and not deal with the other, right? Um, for me, again, I am for, the colorism conversation and perpetuating it, definitely. Some people may be against it, again, because of airing dirty laundry, or perhaps feeling like this is like quote unquote divisive, right? Also, maybe depending on your area, there may be a mix of people, or they may just be majority Black people, so that the population could maybe play a factor in that too. But overall, I think this is definitely something that should be encouraged, and I think this could help the upcoming generation, right? Because oftentimes some people are going through this type of situation at home or at school in their neighborhoods, and they don't even know what to call it. Like, they don't even have the vocabulary. And if you don't even have a name for a problem, how can you deal with a problem? You know, you know. um, Also, the article also gives a you know website link to a toolkit, you know, and this toolkit I will go through in another video, but basically it's a toolkit to help facilitate colorism conversations, and it revolves around reading a comic book that pertains to colorism, that deals with the topic of colorism, and it's coming from a Black man. It was, written and illustrated by a Black man who worked for Marvel Comics at one point, and kind of like him talking about his colorism, kind of like a bit of a run-in in terms of like artwork, right? But that will be discussed and explored in another video. But for now, what do you guys think about this? You know, let me know. I will say, I kind of feel like they may have been kind of like blurring the lines between racism and colorism, because those are, while they are similar, there are differences. I think colorism would be more like internal racism within the race, while racism would be um, from other races, racism from other groups of people. As well, I think that the article did have like a low-key, kind of like downing, disparaging tone toward darker skinned people that I low-key picked up on at times, and I'm like, you know, I'm, I don't know, that kind of a bit, I don't know, it kind of rubbed me the wrong way a little bit. I'm not trying to downplay, colorism or anything, but I'm just saying it kind of was a bit like, oh my God, just woe is me type of thing, right? And I can understand some darker skinned people being sort of offended by that, like, don't look at me like a victim. I get that, all right? But what do you guys think? Let me know in the comment section. Until the next video, adios and goodbye for now.